The sun shone kindly on St. Mary Mead that Saturday afternoon, laying a warm, golden light across the vicarage lawn. The annual garden fete was an event of both cheerful anticipation and mild anxiety, an occasion for the village to demonstrate its unity, its charitable spirit, and, perhaps more truthfully, its competitive streak. Mrs. Bantry had donated several jars of raspberry jam for the raffle, each adorned with gingham lids and ribbons of formidable neatness. Colonel Melchett presided over the coconut shy, puffing and frowning in his usual manner. The vicar's wife fluttered between the tea table and the tombola, her smile growing thinner as the day wore on. It was, in every sense, the sort of day that made outsiders remark on the charm of English village life. Miss Jane Marple, sitting beneath a parasol near the tea cakes, saw it rather differently. She had learned long ago that charm could be quite deceptive. Beneath the politeness of cucumber sandwiches and well-brushed hats lay the same passions, fears, and jealousies one found anywhere else. Only here they were better dressed and more discreetly expressed. From her vantage point beside Mrs. Price Ridley, Miss Marple watched the passing crowd with her usual mild interest. There was young Dr. Leonard Phelps, so earnest, so easily flustered by Mrs. Bantry's teasing. There was Mrs. Ursula Blythe, the new tenant of Primrose Cottage, a pretty woman in her 30s with a pale, anxious face and a habit of glancing over her shoulder as though half expecting someone. "She's a widow, you know," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley, leaning close. "Came down from London not 3 weeks ago. Tragic affair. Her husband died suddenly. Some heart trouble or other. Poor dear, she looks positively haunted." Miss Marple murmured her agreement, though her pale blue eyes followed Mrs. Blythe with quiet curiosity. Haunted, yes, but not, she thought, by grief alone. The fete reached its pleasant crescendo around 4 o'clock, with the raffle drawing and much laughter over Colonel Melchett's unerring ability to miss every coconut. A light breeze stirred the bunting. Teacups clinked. Children darted about with sticky fingers and prize ribbons. Then, quite suddenly, a cry rang out. It came from the direction of the path leading toward the lich gate. A few women screamed, others rushed forward. The cheerful hum of the afternoon died in an instant. When Miss Marple and Mrs. Price Ridley arrived, they found a small knot of people gathered round a bench beneath the chestnut tree. Mrs. Ursula Blythe lay there, white as the linen on the tea tables, her eyes closed, her lips faintly blue. Dr. Phelps knelt beside her, checking her pulse. "Fetch some water," he ordered. "Quickly now." But even before he spoke again, Miss Marple could see it was useless. The stillness of the body, the unnatural repose of the hands. It was the look she had seen once before, years ago, when a young maid in Saint-Martin. The Coles household had taken a sip from the wrong bottle in the pantry. "She's dead," said Dr. Phelps at last, his voice low. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Colonel Melchett's moustache bristled. Good heavens, what the devil! Miss Marple looked down at the empty teacup that had rolled beneath the bench. Her expression did not change, but she noticed one curious thing. A faint, sweet scent clung to the air. Familiar, elusive, and unmistakably artificial, like bitter almonds. The shock held the vicarage lawn in a hush so complete that even the bunting seemed to droop. Then, as shock always does, it unraveled into movement. The vicar's wife pressing smelling salts upon no one in particular, Colonel Melchett sending the gardener sprinting to telephone the station, and the raffle ladies gathering their books with the air of people who have, by unfortunate timing, been caught with money in hand. Dr. Phelps, still kneeling, had recovered his professional voice. He covered Mrs. Blythe's face with his handkerchief and asked, quite gently, if someone might give him a moment. People drew back, relieved to be directed and avid for fresh details. Miss Marple did not press forward. She stood very still and looked at the ground where Ursula Blythe's teacup had come to rest beneath the bench. It had rolled just far enough to catch a sliver of sun. The porcelain glimmered faintly. When the vicar's wife exclaimed that it ought to be removed at once, to avoid upsetting the children, Miss Marple's hand, quite without fuss, found the handle of her reticule and held it closed. "Perhaps best left, dear," she murmured, and somehow the suggestion took hold. The cup remained where it was. "Terrible," Mrs. Price Ridley whispered, pulling her cardigan tight with righteous foreboding. "It will be the London life. They rush about, and it tells upon the heart. My cousin Marjorie's husband had palpitations from kettle drums." "Palpitations do not turn the lips blue," Mrs. Bantry returned, practical and unawed by catastrophe. She looked at Miss Marple, who was considering the underside of the bench. "Jane." Miss Marple smiled her vague grandmotherly smile, the one that made people think they had invented their own conclusions. "It is very sad, Dolly. Such a pretty creature and so nervous. One is reminded of those wood doves that always seem to fly into windows. I dare say Dr. Phelps will tell us the proper medical term." Dr. Phelps, who was in the act of tucking the handkerchief a little more securely, said only, "We must wait for the inspector." His gaze slid, not entirely steadily, toward the tea pavilion. One of the brownies had knocked over a jug, and sticky lemonade was pooling against the bunting box. Word arrived in the manner of all village news, not directly but braided into 10 smaller rumors. Mrs. Ames had it that Mrs. Blythe had been seized with a summer faintness. Mr. Petherick said her color meant suffocation, and suffocation meant a scarf. He had read as much in a magazine. By the time Constable Evans pedalled up, sweating nobly, there existed 3 entirely different versions of who had carried the dead woman. No one had, and at least 2 contradictory accounts of who had poured her last cup of tea. Inspector Slack followed, brisk and sensible, with Colonel Melchett looming at his shoulder. The inspector's quick eyes catalogued what the lawn presented: the bench, the cup, the pricked faces too eager to be innocent. "No one touch anything," he said, already too late and knowing it. "Constable, hold the path." "Sir," he added to the colonel with a nod, "if you'll be so good as to stand there." Miss Marple drifted a little nearer, not forcing notice, yet never quite absent. Slack glanced at her and suppressed a sigh. Experience had taught him that the old lady could be persistent. He turned to Dr. Phelps. "You were first to her?" "I was closest," the young doctor said. "I heard a cry. When I reached her, there was no pulse. I should like to reserve my opinion, Inspector." "Reserve you shall for the moment." Slack bent and, using a handkerchief, parted the grass near the cup. He sniffed, his brows met. "Evans," he said, "bag the cup. Carefully now." The constable produced a brown paper evidence bag with the same ceremonial care he afforded the church silver. The cup, caught in the sun, flashed again as it lifted. It was then that Miss Marple, quite idly, remarked to the vicar's wife that she liked the pattern, the little blue cornflowers around the rim. "So very summery," she said, as if cups mattered and death did not. "Who made the tea?" Slack asked the world at large. "The Mothers' Union," said Mrs. Bantry at once, "but Kitty Bell served the second batch. I saw her. She had some difficulty with the tap of the samovar." "Kitty!" she called, as if summoning a dog. "Where is that girl?" Kitty, pink with alarm and sugar, came forward and bobbed. "Poured for lots of people, ma'am," she said miserably. "I don't recollect who and when. It were all rushy." "You poured for the deceased?" Slack asked. "I might have. She was standing with Mrs. Lunn from the post office when I started. Or was that when I was finishing? I couldn't say." Kitty's eyes filled. "I never did mean harm." "No one is suggesting it," the inspector said, with a patience that surprised those who did not know his methods. "Did anyone bring their own cup?" Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Certainly not." "Mrs. Blythe did have a little bag," offered the vicar's wife, busy being helpful. "Silk?" Pale grey. She had it with her all afternoon. Perhaps there's a handkerchief inside. There may, Slack said, and we shall see. Evans. The constable, now an expert at producing bags, accepted the pale grey reticule and recorded what he removed. Small purse, a powder compact, a folded paper with a London address, and a key tied on a ribbon the colour of primroses. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the ribbon and away, as though noting that spring had visited summer briefly and rather out of place. Primrose Cottage, murmured Mrs. Bantry at Miss Marple's elbow. Her little house. Isn't it a coincidence? The ribbon, the name. Names often match their owners the way dogs do, Miss Marple returned. One must be careful not to trust them on that account. Slack dismissed the crowd, and people obeyed with a relief almost grateful. They could at last disperse into corners and tell one another what they had seen and, more importantly, what they had not. The fete continued in a stuttering fashion, because such things, once set in motion, are not easily stopped. A few children were scolded for laughter. A few adults cried in kitchens where no one could see. By tea-time proper, the village had made up its mind, though not unanimously, what had happened. Ursula Blythe's poor heart, weakened by London and sorrow, had simply given out. The alternative, poison, was whispered and rejected, then whispered again with relish. Poison has a way of fitting too neatly into a cup, like a story into a mind. Miss Marple, declining a fresh scone out of respect and perhaps prudence, found herself beside Dr. Phelps on the gravel. "A great pity," she said softly. "Such a very final sort of faint." Dr. Phelps looked at her sharply. "You think—" "I think," Miss Marple said, as if remembering a distant niece with a tendency to dramatize, "that young women do not, as a rule, turn so very blue unless something has disagreed with them in a rather determined way. But of course I am an old woman and have seen only village tragedies, which are small." She paused. "Did you notice her gloves, dear? The right one had a tiny snag, like the little feathering one gets from catching on wicker. It is surprising what wicker will do." He frowned, casting about. "The bench." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "or something else with a rough edge." Inspector Slack approached them then, his notebook already fielding entries. "Mrs. Blythe took a house in the village. Did either of you know her well?" "No," Dr. Phelps said. "Only professionally." He coloured. "She seemed anxious. I thought it grief. She asked me about sleeping draughts once, but I don't prescribe those lightly." "Anxious about what?" Slack pressed. "Shadows," Dr. Phelps said with an embarrassed little laugh. "Her word, not mine." "People often fear the wrong shadows," Miss Marple observed. "In my goddaughter's school, there was a girl who dreaded geese and never noticed the step she always missed." Slack eyed her, undecided whether she had said anything or everything. "Thank you," he said, which meant in his dialect, "Not now. We'll need statements. Doctor, later at the surgery, Miss Marple—" He hesitated, then remembered to be sensible. "You were near the deceased. Anything you observed?" "Oh dear," Miss Marple said, the picture of helpless recollection. "Only that the tea today is stronger than usual. Mrs. Bell does like it stout. In some households, one sees it with widowers. The preference runs to the other extreme, weak and very sweet, so they may have many cups without feeling it at all. It tells you a great deal who puts sugar in before the tea." She smiled kindly. "It is so comforting habit." Slack jotted something he did not understand and moved away. When the tables were finally folded and the lawn set to rights, Miss Marple allowed herself one last glance at the chestnut shade. A faint, sweet tang still clung to the heat, stubborn as perfume on a scarf. She thought of the primrose ribbon, the snag in the glove, and the silk reticule with a key tied like a child's reminder. "Shadows," she repeated, very low. Then she set off along the lane toward the high street, where gossip would be ripening like plums on a wall, and, Among it, one overripe fruit might give itself away by the wasps it drew. Evening drifted softly over St. Mary Mead, wrapping the thatched roofs in a blue haze that seemed too gentle for a day so bruised by death. The fete tables had been cleared, the bunting folded away, and only a few crumbs and paper ribbons remained to mark where the laughter had been. Yet under that quiet surface, the village buzzed like a hive disturbed, each cottage a cell of speculation. At the Blue Boar, voices rose and fell over pints. At Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, teacups replaced the fairground china, but the conversation was no less breathless. Miss Hartnell declared she'd seen poor Mrs. Blythe take her tea black, like foreigners do, while Mrs. Price Ridley countered that such habits unsettle the Constitution. Colonel Melchett, summoned by Inspector Slack, said very little, though his jaw tightened each time a theory grew too imaginative. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively in her corner of the Bantry's sitting room, knitting something pale and unidentifiable. Her needles clicked in an even rhythm while the others argued over the finer points of heart failure and poison. Every so often she would murmur something vague and reasonable, which had the useful effect of turning the tide of conversation without anyone realizing who had done it. Slack says the toxicologist's results will take a day or two, Mrs. Bantry announced, pouring more tea. He's taken the teacup, the remains of the pot, and even the sugar bowl. Heaven help the man who likes his tea sweet tonight. Miss Marple gave a small hum. Quite right of him, Dolly. One must never underestimate sugar. It conceals so much, don't you think? Bitterness, for one. Colonel Melchett looked up sharply, but Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on her knitting. The colonel had seen her like that before, apparently absent, yet with a mind that noticed everything others stepped past. Slack's got his eye on that girl, Kitty Bell, he said. Seems the most likely, being the one who poured out. Young fool might have mixed up a jug or mistaken something on the table. I shouldn't think so, said Miss Marple mildly. Kitty's a careless girl, but not clumsy in that particular way. One sees a great deal about people who handle cups all day. She's used to balancing trays, never spills a drop unless she means to. You imply she might mean to, said Melchett, frowning. Miss Marple's needles paused. Oh dear me, no. Only that intention is a delicate matter. A girl like Kitty would need a strong reason to harm a woman she scarcely knew. And a much stronger stomach. There's a kind of revulsion in innocence, Colonel. One can't act beyond it without trembling. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, eyes alight. Then you think it wasn't the girl? I said so from the start. I think, Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting, that Mrs. Blythe's cup was not poured for her at all. A murmur went around the room. Even the colonel blinked. What's that now? Miss Marple smiled faintly, as if she had said something about the weather. It is curious, is it not, that she took her tea apart from the others, near the bench, a little to the side. People who wish to avoid company often do so for one of two reasons, shyness or fear of being seen. Mrs. Bantry caught her breath. You think she was hiding? Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, or waiting. That night, St. Mary Mead slept restlessly. Curtains twitched long after the lamps were out. At Primrose Cottage, the constable stood guard outside the gate, a dark shape against the pale moonlight. The little house looked peaceful enough, a whitewashed wall, a front garden of overgrown lavender, and the faint gleam of silver under the porch where a key had been dropped and forgotten. By morning, the story had grown legs. Mrs. Blythe had been poisoned deliberately, said one camp. Accidentally, said another. By herself, whispered a third. Someone remembered she had been seen visiting the post office twice that week, and Mrs. Lunn swore that one of the letters she sent was addressed abroad. Abroad, in St. Mary Mead, might as well have been the moon. It meant secrets. Inspector Slack arrived early to examine the cottage. Miss Marple, of course, was already there, having brought a jar of quince jelly for the constable, poor man, standing out in the chill. It was a perfectly acceptable excuse, and by the time Slack emerged from the front door, she was quietly pruning the lavender hedge with a pair of small scissors. "Good morning, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "You've been very industrious, I see." Slack eyed her warily. "You seem to be everywhere, Miss Marple." "Oh, not everywhere," she said. "Only where people forget to look." He grunted. "Nothing much in there. Tidy little place. No medicine bottles, no odd powders, just some letters, all from London. Bills, mostly. There's a photograph on the mantel. Husband, I suppose. Military uniform. Dead 3 months. Phelps says heart failure." 3 months, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "That's not very long to find a new home and start again. Most widows, well, they tend to settle near friends, not strangers." She said she wanted quiet. Quiet can mean many things. Miss Marple straightened, brushing a lavender sprig from her sleeve. "You didn't find a key?" Slack frowned. "No, but the constable did pick up one near the porch. Must have fallen from her bag." "Ah." Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes brightened. "The bag with the primrose ribbon. That's the one." "Why?" "Only that people seldom tie ribbons to things unless they wish to distinguish them from others," she said. "It reminds me of old Mr. Hawkes, the verger, who used to paint the handles of his tools red because someone kept borrowing them. He said, 'They'll know which are mine now.' It worked, too, until the thief simply took the red ones first." Slack looked at her, unsure whether to take this as wisdom or nonsense. "So you think someone borrowed her key?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that a ribbon can tell us who wished to be remembered and who wished not to." She gave a little sigh. "Such delicate things, clues. They're like embroidery stitches, visible only when one looks from the wrong side." Slack rubbed his chin. "You always talk in riddles, Miss Marple." "Life is rather a riddle, Inspector. Death, too, I suppose." That afternoon, the vicar's wife called upon Miss Marple to deliver what she termed a Christian duty of condolence, though she admitted privately it was more of an opportunity for information. She brought with her a small parcel, a book found in Mrs. Blythe's cottage, marked with the church's lending label. "The poor thing never returned it," she said sorrowfully. "And such a curious choice, too. Milton's Paradise Lost. Not what one expects from a lady fond of pretty ribbons." Miss Marple turned the book in her hands, noting the faint scent that clung to it, a familiar, bitter trace beneath the sweetness of dust. She said nothing, but her mind turned quietly, arranging what she knew into a delicate pattern. Ursula Blythe had been fearful, perhaps waiting for someone. She had tied a primrose ribbon to her key, an odd, deliberate touch. And now there was this scent again, so faint, so insistent. That evening, when the sun dipped behind the elms, Miss Marple walked home past Primrose Cottage. A shutter banged softly against the wall. Somewhere inside, a clock ticked, forgotten. She paused by the gate, her expression unreadable. It was not, she thought, merely a death that had occurred. It was the ending of something begun long before St. Mary Mead ever saw Ursula Blythe's pale face. And somewhere in the village, perhaps among the gossipers sipping tea, perhaps among those pretending not to care, someone knew exactly why. The following morning arrived pale and damp, as if the sky itself disapproved of gossip. Mist clung to the hedgerows along the lane from the church to the green, and the sound of milk bottles clinking echoed strangely in the quiet. By breakfast time, the events of the fete had already transformed into something resembling legend. Each retelling of Mrs. Blythe's final moments gained another listener and another detail, the fluttering of her hand, the color of her eyes, the last word she might have spoken. Miss Marple listened to none of it firsthand. She preferred to let the morning settle before stirring it. At 10:30, Inspector Slack arrived at the vicarage. His boots carried the moisture of the lane, and his expression carried the irritation of a man whose facts refused to arrange themselves neatly. Miss Marple was there already, having come ostensibly to bring some knitting patterns for the vicar's wife. She sat near the window with her cup of tea, serene as the parlour clock. "Morning, Miss Marple," Slack said, with the politeness one uses when addressing an unavoidable witness. "Thought I might have a word, Mrs. Clement. I've been up to the chemist's this morning." "Indeed?" Miss Marple asked softly, before the vicar's wife could respond. "Such a busy place so early. Poor Mr. Footman. He'll have been quite rushed." Slack gave her a narrow look. "You seem to know everyone's schedule, Miss Marple." "One must, Inspector," she replied mildly. "It's a necessity in a village. If one doesn't know where people are, one is forever knocking on empty doors." He grunted and turned to Mrs. Clement. "The chemist confirms what I suspected. Prussic acid, cyanide, strong and clean, traces in the cup and on the rim too. It wasn't accidental, ma'am." Mrs. Clement gave a small gasp, covering her mouth. "How dreadful! Then it was murder?" "Undeniably," said Slack. "The question is who managed it in the middle of the garden fete without anyone noticing. The tea table was crowded, people coming and going. I'll have to speak to everyone who had access." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Forgive me, Inspector, but you said there were traces on the rim. That suggests the poison was already in the cup before she drank, not poured in afterward." "That's right," Slack said. "Means she picked up the wrong one, or someone handed it to her." "Or," Miss Marple said delicately, "someone made quite sure she picked up the right one." Slack stared at her, waiting for elaboration, but she only smiled faintly and returned to her stitches. By midday, St. Mary Mead was officially a village under suspicion. Constable Evans went from door to door taking statements while Slack stationed himself in the parlour of the Blue Boar, turning it into a temporary interview room. Miss Hartnell declared this most improper and swore she'd seen the inspector taking notes over a pint. The first to be questioned was Kitty Bell. She arrived with red eyes and trembling hands, still protesting that she couldn't remember who she'd served. "We're all rushy, sir, and I was helping Mrs. Ames with the sugar bowls. Maybe I poured for her, maybe I didn't." Slack's patience wore thin quickly, but Miss Marple, who had come to the Blue Boar on the pretext of returning a borrowed book, sat quietly in a far corner, sipping lemonade and observing the girl. It wasn't fear of guilt that shook Kitty, Miss Marple noted. It was the fear of being blamed. A guilty person looks inward, she reflected, but an innocent one searches desperately for reassurance. When Slack asked if she'd noticed Mrs. Blythe speaking to anyone, Kitty hesitated. "Only that gentleman, sir, the one what called himself Mr. Darnley. He'd been talking to her by the rose tent. Said he knew her from before." Slack frowned. "Darnley? Didn't see his name on any of the fate lists." "Oh, he weren't from here," Kitty said. "Came down on the bus, I think. Nice enough coat, but shabby shoes. He had London ways about him." Miss Marple looked up at that. London ways. It was a phrase that could mean anything, too confident, too familiar, or too practiced at concealment. She remembered Mrs. Blythe's anxious glances at the fete, her pale fingers fidgeting with that primrose ribbon. Waiting, indeed, but perhaps not for comfort. That afternoon, the story of Mr. Darnley swept through St. Mary Mead like a summer storm. He had been seen by Mrs. Price Ridley near the post office, tall, dark, and shifty, and by Mr. Petherick near the green, respectable enough, but asking questions. Within hours, he had been a solicitor, a suitor, and a blackmailer, depending on whom one asked. Miss Marple made no comment. Instead, she paid a visit to the postmistress, Mrs. Lunn, who was sorting envelopes with exaggerated innocence. "Such a sad business," Miss Marple said gently. "I understand Mrs. Blythe was in here not long ago. Twice, I believe." "That's right," Mrs. Lunn said, eyes bright with interest. "She sent one letter to a bank in London and another to a hotel. Foreign stamp, mind you. Paris, I think. Oh, she seemed nervous enough. looked over her shoulder twice before writing the address. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Fear and guilt are such similar creatures. Both make one look behind." When she left the post office, the church bells were tolling 6. The mist had returned, curling in from the meadows, and the air carried the scent of earth after rain. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the green, her mind turning like the steady rhythm of her needles. A man from London. A frightened widow. A key tied with a ribbon, and the scent of bitter almonds that lingered in both the cup and the cottage. At her gate, she paused, looking toward Primrose Cottage. A figure moved there, a woman's shape, bending near the door. It was Mrs. Bantry, curiosity outweighing caution. "Jane," she called softly when she saw her. "You'll never believe it. The inspectors found something in the garden, buried just under the rose bed." Miss Marple joined her, careful not to disturb the soil. Slack stood nearby, holding a small, mud-streaked bottle between gloved fingers. The cork was missing, but even in the cooling air, a faint chemical scent drifted up, sharp and unmistakable. "Cyanide," Slack said grimly. "Hidden under her own roses. Looks like the lady was planning something herself." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "You mean suicide? Or a clever way to throw us off?" Slack said. "Hard to say yet." Miss Marple looked down at the roses, their pink petals heavy with dew. "So strange," she murmured. "People always think burying things hides them. But gardens have memories, Inspector. They tell what's been planted and what shouldn't have been." Slack pocketed the bottle and turned to his men. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her gaze tracing the pattern of footprints in the soft soil. 2 sets, one small, one larger. The larger had been made recently, perhaps after the rain, and led not from the gate, but from the back path that wound toward the fields. "Someone came," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "Someone who knew she would be alone." As the inspector's car pulled away and the village lights flickered on, Miss Marple stood by the roses until the last trace of daylight faded. The faint scent of almonds still hung in the air. It was, she thought, the kind of fragrance that lingered not by accident, but by design. That night, rain came at last, thin, persistent, and whispering against the windows like someone speaking secrets too softly to hear. Miss Marple, sitting by her hearth with a single lamp burning low, found herself reviewing the day's discoveries in her quiet, methodical way. The bottle beneath the roses, the footprints in the soil, the mention of Mr. Darnley, and that lingering scent, all formed threads in a fabric still too tangled to show its pattern. She had, in her long experience, learned to distrust the obvious. Suicide was too simple, too convenient, and Inspector Slack's relief at the notion was almost proof against it. She had just put aside her knitting when a timid knock came at the door. Opening it, she found Kitty Bell standing there, soaked to the bone, her apron clinging to her knees and eyes wide as saucers. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, "I couldn't think where else to go. They'll say I done it, I know they will." Miss Marple guided her gently inside. "Now, my dear, there's no need to shake so. Sit yourself by the fire. I'll fetch a towel." Kitty obeyed, clutching her damp hands together. "They asked me again, the inspector and the colonel both, how many cups I poured, who I talked to, what I saw. I told them everything I could remember, but it keeps muddling up in my head. There were so many people, and she, Mrs. Blythe, she looked right past me like I wasn't there." Miss Marple returned with a towel and draped it over the girl's shoulders. "Sometimes, dear, when people are frightened, they see only what they're afraid of." "She was frightened, wasn't she?" Kitty said, eyes round. "She kept looking round all day, and when that man spoke to her, her hand shook so she near dropped her cup. I thought maybe she'd had bad news, but he weren't cruel. Just pressing, like he had something she didn't want to hear." "What sort of man was he?" Miss Marple asked. "Tallish, dark hair, but thinning at the front. Smiled a lot, but his eyes didn't. Called her Lucy, though her name weren't that, was it? She told him not to call her that, and then she laughed. Oh, Miss Marple, not a real laugh. The kind you make when you've run out of better things to say. Miss Marple poured a little sherry into a glass and set it in Kitty's hand. There, that will do you good. And you're quite right, her name wasn't Lucy. People who use false names often slip on the truth. It comes out uninvited, like a weed through gravel. Kitty blinked. You think she wasn't who she said she was? I think, dear, said Miss Marple softly, that Mrs. Blythe may have been two different women at once, and only one of them died at the fete. When Kitty had gone home, calmer but still bewildered, Miss Marple sat again in silence, watching the fire shrink to embers. The mention of a false name had stirred something in her memory. A story from years ago about a woman who'd fled London under an assumed identity after a scandalous trial. She couldn't recall the name, only that it involved a disappearance, a vanished fortune, and a husband who was said to have died abroad. The next morning, while the rest of St. Mary Mead busied itself with speculation, Miss Marple took a quiet walk to the library. She requested the London papers from early spring and spent 2 hours in patient reading. By 11, she had found what she sought, a report of a small inquest concerning a Mr. Leonard Blythe, a stockbroker found dead at his desk. The verdict had been heart failure, though the article hinted delicately at financial irregularities. His widow, one Mrs. Ursula Blythe, née Lucy Darnley. Miss Marple folded the paper neatly and returned it to the stack, her eyes bright. Lucy Darnley. So the man at the fete had called her by her true name, and she had not wanted the village to hear it. A woman fleeing disgrace might seek refuge in quiet St. Mary Mead, but disgrace, Miss Marple knew, was a poor travelling companion. It rarely stayed buried for long. By afternoon, Slack was back at Primrose Cottage, interviewing the housemaid who had come in twice a week. Miss Marple, ostensibly bringing flowers for the mantel, was permitted to hover discreetly nearby. The maid, a simple country girl, confessed that her mistress had been ever so nervous lately. Always checking the locks, she was, and once she asked me if there was another key to the back gate. I said there weren't, not since old Mr. Simmons lost it last year. Slack frowned. So she'd reason to fear someone getting in. I'd say so, sir, and there was a letter come for her that morning, too. Foreign writing on it. She burned it straight away, she did. Never seen her do that before. When the girl left, Slack turned to Miss Marple. You were right about fear. Someone had her properly terrified. But I don't see why a blackmailer would kill their victim. Cuts off the payments, doesn't it? Unless, Miss Marple said, gazing at the fireplace, the blackmailer had something to lose if she talked first, or if she had begun to fight back. He eyed her. You think this Darnley fellow killed her? Miss Marple hesitated, then shook her head. Not necessarily. Fear makes strange companions. It's quite possible she trusted the wrong person entirely. That evening, as twilight bled across the village, Colonel Melchett dropped by Miss Marple's cottage. He carried an envelope in his hand. Got this from the London police, he said, lowering his voice. Background on your Mrs. Blythe. Seems she was mixed up in a nasty little business, a firm that went under, funds missing, husband dead, and suspicion pointing her way. No charge, though. Not enough proof. Proof, Miss Marple murmured, is so often a matter of who remains to speak. Melchett frowned. If that Darnley chap came after her about the money, it could fit. Maybe she refused him. Maybe he silenced her. Perhaps, said Miss Marple. Or perhaps he came to warn her. People who feel guilt sometimes find conscience inconveniently late. She watched as the colonel rose to leave, the envelope still on her table. When he was gone, she unfolded its contents, a faded photograph of Mrs. Blythe beside her husband, smiling stiffly in a London garden. Behind them stood another man, just stepping out of frame, his face half-shadowed but unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same shape of mouth she had heard described by Kitty Bell, Mr. Darnley himself. Miss Marple stared at it for a long moment. Then, quite suddenly, she remembered something else. The faint snag on Mrs. Blythe's glove, the kind of tear a wicker handle might make, and in her mind the garden fete appeared again, the cups, the trays, the laughter, and the single teacup that had rolled beneath the bench. She rose, setting her knitting aside once more. "Yes," she said softly. "I think it's time to look again at that bench." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air smelled of wet earth and something faintly metallic. St. Mary Mead, for all its peace, was holding its breath. And Miss Marple, walking into the mist toward the vicarage lawn, felt certain that before long someone else would make a very dangerous mistake. One that would show her exactly who had placed death so carefully in a teacup. The next morning dawned clear, with the kind of deceptive brightness that seems to deny all possibility of darkness. The rain had washed the air clean, and the village wore an air of brisk innocence, as though St. Mary Mead had collectively decided that whatever horror had occurred must now be politely forgotten. But Miss Marple knew better. Silence in a village was never peace. It was only the sound of secrets rearranging themselves. She walked up toward the vicarage lawn just after breakfast. The fete tables had long been cleared away, but the grass still bore faint indentations where chairs had stood and where, beneath the chestnut tree, Ursula Blythe had drawn her last breath. The bench remained, though now its seat had been wiped dry by the morning sun. Miss Marple bent down, inspecting the woven wickerwork of its armrest. The small snag she remembered on Mrs. Blythe's glove came to mind. Indeed, there was a splintered edge where one strand had broken loose. Nothing so unusual about that. But when she touched it lightly, something fine and pale fluttered free. A thread. Silk, primrose yellow. She held it in her hand for a moment, feeling the tremor of a thought forming. The ribbon from the key. She remembered the way it had been tied, neat but not new, slightly frayed as if from use. Perhaps not tied to a key at all originally, but to something else. She folded the thread carefully into her handkerchief and rose. Behind her came the crunch of boots. "You again, Miss Marple." Inspector Slack's voice, though resigned, held a trace of admiration. I might have guessed. "Good morning, Inspector," she said serenely. "I was only admiring the bench. Such sturdy workmanship." Slack peered down. "If it's the same bench that held our victim, I'd rather not sit on it. I've had word from London. This Darnley fellow's a bad lot. Wanted in connection with several shady deals. Arrived by train the morning of the fete and gone by evening. Ticket back to Paddington. Fits our timeline neatly." "Neatly," Miss Marple repeated, as though the word itself were suspicious. "Did he buy a return ticket, I wonder?" Slack blinked. "What difference would that make?" "Oh, none at all," she said mildly. "Only that people who intend mischief seldom trouble to arrange a way home." He frowned, but said nothing. She could see in his face the mixture of irritation and reluctant respect that men like him always felt toward her. He half suspected she was laughing at him, and half suspected she was right. They walked together toward Primrose Cottage. Slack spoke of the bottle, of fingerprints to be analyzed, of London's assistance. Miss Marple listened politely, thinking instead of the roses, of Kitty Bell's trembling account, and of the curious absence of any letter remaining in the house. A woman so fearful would hardly destroy her last contact with the world without reason. At the cottage, Slack went inside to check the results of the previous day's search. Miss Marple lingered by the garden path, noting the fresh boot marks over the older ones she had seen before. But there, just beyond the rose bed, something caught her eye. A faint imprint of a heel smaller than her own, lighter yet distinct. She bent down. A woman's shoe. Not Mrs. Blythe's. Those had been heeled higher. Someone else had come to the garden after the rain. When Slack re-emerged, she pointed to it quietly. "You see, Inspector, one doesn't usually garden in court shoes." He followed her gaze, muttered something about confounded amateurs, and signaled for Constable Evans. "Mark that spot. We'll have it photographed." As they turned back toward the lane, they were met by Colonel Melchett, whose face bore the curious expression of a man both satisfied and disturbed. "We've found your Mr. Darnley," he said, "at least what's left of him." Slack straightened. "What?" "Pulled from the mill stream 1/2 mile past the bridge. Dead at least a day. Pockets empty, but the landlord from the Blue Boar identified him. Poor devil must have taken a fall in the dark, or been helped to it." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly, though her voice remained calm. "How unfortunate," she said, "to fall into a stream one never intended to cross." Melchett looked uneasy. "Slack, you'll have to see to the formalities. Coroner, London police, all that. I've left the constable there." When the two men departed, Miss Marple remained at the gate, the pieces shifting in her mind. A frightened woman, a man from her past, both dead within a day of each other. It might have seemed like tragedy's natural conclusion, yet to Miss Marple it rang false. Fear and accident seldom share a bed. That evening, St. Mary Mead thrummed again with talk, now of double deaths and cursed affairs. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it a lesson in morals, and Mrs. Bantry, less pious, simply called it extraordinary. Miss Marple listened as ever from her usual chair by the fire, her needles moving soundlessly while others' tongues clattered. "Mark my words," said Mrs. Bantry. "The fellow chased her down here to get money, and when she refused, he poisoned her and ran. Then he lost his footing and, splash, justice by Providence." "Providence is rarely so efficient," Miss Marple murmured, "and streams do not usually collect empty pockets without help." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "You mean someone else? Only that guilt can be an inconvenient thing to carry," Miss Marple said softly. "People drop it wherever they can." The next morning brought a letter from Miss Marple, delivered by the postmistress herself. "Came with the London mail, miss," said Mrs. Lunn, eyes round with curiosity. "Postmarked 2 days ago? Funny thing, addressed in a trembling hand. Thought it might be from a relative of yours." When Miss Marple opened it, her breath caught ever so slightly. Inside lay a short note, the writing hurried, blotched with what might have been raindrops or tears. "If anything should happen to me, tell them I never meant harm. The key will explain it all. Keep it safe, U.B." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it with care. The key, tied with its primrose ribbon, was in the inspector's keeping, but she remembered how it had caught the light. So ordinary, yet not quite the shape of a house key. It was smaller, finer, like the key to a box. And suddenly she saw it, clear as if the past had unfolded before her. The ribbon, the garden bench, the snagged glove. Mrs. Blythe had sat down holding that key in her hand, perhaps nervous, perhaps determined, and someone she trusted, had taken it from her, tying it neatly afterward to make it seem her own doing. Miss Marple rose at once, taking her shawl. The time for quiet reflection had passed. The story of the frightened widow and the London scoundrel had been too convenient, too patly concluded. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone still walked free with guilt pressed close like a hidden letter. As she stepped into the crisp morning, the church bell struck 9. She turned toward the vicarage path, her mind already 3 steps ahead. Somewhere among the talkative, ordinary faces of the village lay the truth, and Miss Marple, with her soft voice and sharper eyes, intended to find it before the day was out. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage just as the morning post was being sorted in the study. The vicar looked up from a pile of envelopes, smiling faintly, though there was a shadow of unease behind his mild eyes. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I suppose you've heard about poor Darnley." I have indeed, she said softly, setting her gloves upon the table. It does make one wonder, doesn't it, whether justice and coincidence have learned to share a timetable. He blinked at her in confusion, as people often did when she spoke in riddles that made perfect sense to her and only half sense to others. I dare say Inspector Slack will get to the bottom of it. Oh, I don't doubt that he will, she said cheerfully, though in her heart she doubted very much indeed. He is a most determined man, but sometimes one must look not at the bottom, but at the surface. The things so ordinary they are invisible. Before the vicar could respond, the door opened and Mrs. Clement hurried in, a folded sheet of paper in her hand. Jane, how fortunate you're here. This came from the inspector. He's asking if you'd accompany him to the station this morning. Something about that letter you mentioned yesterday. Miss Marple took the note with a polite murmur. Slack's writing was blunt, decisive, and smudged in 2 places, as though written in haste. Please attend, if convenient. New developments concerning the deceased's effects. Need your recollection regarding Key. Well, Miss Marple said, rising, if the inspector requests one's memory, it would be unkind not to bring it along. At the station, Slack met her with his usual air of weary suspicion, though today there was a glint of curiosity in his expression. On the desk before him lay the key, still tied with its primrose ribbon. We had this examined, he said. Not a house key, like you said. Belongs to a small case. We found the matching lock in a trunk at Primrose Cottage. False bottom, covered with lining paper. The trunk contained ladies' things, clothes, trinkets, and this. He lifted a thin, leather-bound case and opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded document, yellowed at the edges. Slack held it up. Certificate of marriage. Between one Lucy Darnley and Leonard Blythe. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Not Ursula Blythe, then. So she had married under her real name. Seems so. But here's where it gets interesting. The date, 5 years ago. And according to records, Leonard Blythe had already been married once before to a Miss Harriet Vale. No record of divorce. Miss Marple's lips pressed together in a thoughtful line. Ah, then poor Mrs. Blythe was not a widow at all, but rather an unknowing, what shall we say, duplicate? Bigamy, more like, Slack said grimly. But the fellow's dead, and she's dead, so what's to be done with it? Unless the motive runs deeper. He leaned back, eyeing her. That letter you got, what did it mean? The key will explain it all. Explain what? Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on the certificate. Perhaps, Inspector, it was meant to explain what she had only just discovered, that she was never truly married. Imagine such a thing, building one's life upon trust and finding it counterfeit. A woman like that might fear not only scandal, but the return of those who had deceived her. Slack grunted. So she runs off to the country, hides under another name. Then Darnley turns up. Maybe the brother, maybe the partner in crime. And she panics. Or, Miss Marple said gently, she forgives him. People often do, especially women who have loved unwisely. He gave her a sharp look. Forgive the man who ruined her life? I'd sooner believe she poisoned him. Miss Marple smiled faintly. One must never underestimate the generosity of fools, Inspector. Slack said nothing for a moment, then opened another envelope. There's one more thing. The doctor's report on Darnley. He didn't drown by accident. Blow to the head first. Someone made sure he went in that water. And his pocket's empty, Miss Marple said softly. So the letter she burned might not have been from him, but about him. Perhaps from someone warning her. Slack frowned. You mean someone else in this village? Quite possibly. Secrets have a way of seeking company. She turned to look out the small window of the office, where the lane wound toward the green. I should like to see Mrs. Bantry this afternoon, if you don't mind. She's a most reliable source of unreliable gossip. Gossip? He said dryly. You think that'll solve it? I think, Inspector, she said with a twinkle, that gossip is human nature rehearsing its confessions. Later that day, Miss Marple sat once more in the Bantry's cheerful sitting room. Mrs. Bantry was pouring out tea with her usual relish for the dramatic. "So they've found 2 bodies now," she declared. "You must admit, Jane, we've never had such excitement since the Colonel's nephew eloped with that dreadful chorus girl." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, accepting her cup, "though elopements rarely require poison." Mrs. Bantry's eyes brightened. "Ah, then it was poison. I told Arthur so, and that girl, Kitty Bell, poor thing, she's been beside herself, says she's seen someone watching her house at night." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air. "Watching her, did she say?" "Yes, last 2 nights, she says. A shadow near the hedgerow, probably her imagination, but she swears it's real. Arthur told her to keep her door bolted." "Wise advice," Miss Marple said softly. "Still, I think I should pay her a visit this evening. The imagination can be dangerous when left alone with guilt or fear." Dusk found her at Kitty Bell's cottage. The girl opened the door, pale and anxious. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect you. I've hardly slept since they found that man. I keep thinking, what if he weren't alone? What if someone else knows I saw them talking?" Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. "My dear, you are quite safe. But tell me, was there anything else you noticed? Anything small, perhaps, that others might have overlooked?" Kitty bit her lip. "Well, it's a silly thing, really. But when I cleared away the cups after, there was one missing. I thought maybe someone had taken it off by mistake. But Mrs. Blythe's wasn't there." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Not there? Are you quite sure?" "Certain. I'd counted them. There were always 12. That day only 11 went back." Miss Marple stood very still, her fingers tightening slightly on her shawl. "Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful." She walked back through the gathering mist, her thoughts weaving the new fact into the fragile fabric of her theory. A missing cup. A key that opened not a door, but a truth. A woman living under another name, and a man dead with his pockets emptied. Somewhere, hidden, behind all that fear and deceit, was a third hand, clever, quiet, and certain of remaining unseen. But Miss Marple had long since learned that murderers, like bad knitters, always left a loose thread, and she had just begun to tug at it. The next morning dawned grey and hushed, as if the world were holding its breath. A fine drizzle hung in the air, dampening the village green and blurring the edges of the cottages. Miss Marple, who rose early out of lifelong habit, sat by her window with her breakfast tray, gazing thoughtfully at the lane below. The pieces were moving now. She could feel it, the story knitting itself together, stitch by careful stitch. Only one thing remained uncertain: whose hand had guided the pattern from the start? By mid-morning she had called upon Inspector Slack at the station, ostensibly to bring him a jar of quince jelly, which he accepted with the air of a man who would rather have a confession. He looked tired, but there was a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "We've got something, Miss Marple. That missing cup the girl mentioned. It's turned up. Fished out of the stream near where we found Darnley's body." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Indeed. How curious that both should end up in the same place." "Curious, yes, but helpful too. There's residue inside. The lab says cyanide again. Looks like Darnley pocketed the cup after the fete. Maybe to hide the evidence. And then someone decided he'd outlived his usefulness." Miss Marple regarded him with mild sympathy, as though speaking to a clever child who'd nearly solved a riddle but missed one crucial clue. "That's one explanation, certainly. But tell me, Inspector, was the cup chipped?" Slack blinked. "Chipped? No. Why?" "Oh, I was merely wondering. You see, people who handle china carefully tend to do so from habit, not fear. But a guilty conscience now, that makes the hand tremble." He frowned at her cryptic remark, but before he could reply, Constable Evans came in, his face flushed with excitement. Beg pardon, sir, but there's been another discovery. At Primrose Cottage. The gardener found a tin box buried under the tool shed. Locked, but we managed to open it. Slack motioned him on. Well, what's in it? Letters, sir. Dozens of them, all signed LD and addressed to Mrs. Blythe, though some go back to before she came here. They're full of talk about money, missing investments, bank drafts. Seems like a regular correspondence. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered faintly. And perhaps a record of debts unpaid, Inspector. Blackmail, most likely. People rarely bury sentiment, but they often bury proof. Slack turned to her sharply. Then it's true. Darnley was extorting her. Possibly, Miss Marple said, rising. But one must always ask who benefits from exposure and who gains from silence. When she returned home, the rain had eased into a mist that clung to the hedges like breath. She sat at her writing desk, thinking. The discovery of the letters confirmed part of what she had suspected. Mrs. Blythe, Lucy Darnley, had been hiding from her past, but she had not been killed for it. The pattern of fear was too old, too habitual. The murder had come not from London's shadows, but from the village itself, from someone who had learned her secret only recently and who had used it, quite ruthlessly, to their advantage. Her thoughts were interrupted by a light knock at the door. It was Dr. Phelps, his face drawn and pale. Miss Marple, he began, I hope you don't think me foolish, but I've been uneasy since the fete. I can't stop wondering, was it my fault? I'd been treating Mrs. Blythe for her nerves, you see. She asked about sleeping draughts, and I refused to prescribe them. I thought she might, well, take too many. Miss Marple gestured for him to sit. You did the right thing, Doctor. But perhaps you can tell me, did she ever mention anyone she feared or trust? He hesitated. She spoke of someone she once considered a friend. A woman, I think. She said she had written once too often and was sorry for it. I assumed she meant a relative. A woman, Miss Marple repeated softly. Yes, I dare say she did. She poured him tea with her usual unhurried precision. You know, Doctor, wickedness in women is often very tidy. It never likes to leave fingerprints, only impressions. When Dr. Phelps departed, Miss Marple fetched her old black umbrella and set out for the high street. Her destination was not the police station this time, but the post office. Mrs. Lunn was in her usual place behind the counter, sorting letters with exaggerated care. So dreadful, all this business, Mrs. Lunn said at once. Such goings-on, and that poor lady, may she rest in peace. You know, Miss Marple, I can't think how she managed to keep up with her correspondence. Always buying stamps, that one. Every Tuesday afternoon like clockwork. Tuesday? Miss Marple asked, feigning mild surprise. How regular of her. Did anyone ever collect letters for her? Oh, sometimes, said Mrs. Lunn, lowering her voice. Her friend from the library, Mrs. Price Ridley. She said the poor dear didn't like to be seen too often herself, what with all the gossip about London. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her eyes sharpened. Mrs. Price Ridley was very kind then, one might even say protective. Mrs. Lunn chuckled. Protective, that's one word for it. She liked to know everyone's business, if you ask me. But she and Mrs. Blythe did talk often. I've seen them walking together toward the lane. Miss Marple left soon after, her steps slower now, deliberate. By the time she reached her cottage, the mist had thickened again, wrapping the roofs and chimneys in a ghostly veil. She went to her little writing desk and drew out the primrose thread she had kept in her handkerchief. Holding it up to the lamplight, she saw what she had expected. The faintest trace of blue lint wound around it. Wool from a cardigan, one she had seen only yesterday, on the shoulders of Mrs. Price Ridley. The next morning she paid a visit to Colonel Melchett, who was going over reports with Slack. "You've found your murderer, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "Or rather, your murderess. The one who hides her malice beneath respectability and her envy behind good works." Slack blinked. "Price Ridley?" That old busybody? You can't be serious." "I'm quite serious," Miss Marple said. She discovered Lucy Darnley's secret from those letters she so kindly posted. It must have been irresistible, a chance to remind the village that sin hides in fine clothes. But when Mrs. Blythe refused to let herself be blackmailed further, Mrs. Price Ridley decided to make her silence permanent. She took the poison from her own garden, bitter almonds from her laurel hedge, and slipped it into the teacup when Kitty Bell turned away. Later, when Darnley came looking for his share, she met him by the stream, and he, being far less genteel, threatened her. So she silenced him too. Melchett stared at her. "Good Lord, Jane. Are you sure?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Quite sure. There's a splinter of wicker in her cardigan sleeve and a thread of primrose silk caught in the hem. You'll find the rest of the ribbon hidden in her sewing basket. She's a very tidy woman, you know, but even the tidiest leave loose ends." She left them in stunned silence, stepping back into the crisp morning air. The mist had lifted now, and sunlight lay across the village roofs, bright and cold. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her thoughts serene. St. Mary Mead would settle again soon, as it always did, its gardens trimmed, its gossip refreshed, its wickedness buried beneath the polite chatter of teacups. And as she reached her gate, she smiled to herself. Evil, she thought, was rarely dramatic. It was most often found among the respectable, the punctual, and the precise, those who prided themselves on never spilling a drop. Inspector Slack returned to Miss Marple's cottage the following afternoon, his usual briskness softened by something almost like humility. "Well, Miss Marple," he began, removing his hat and wiping his brow, "we've done as you suggested. Searched Mrs. Price Ridley's house from attic to scullery. Found the primrose ribbon tucked inside a darning basket, just where you said it would be." Miss Marple poured tea for him without surprise. "I'm glad," she said gently. "It's always so much better when things come back to their proper place." Slack gave a short laugh. "Proper place? I'd call it proof. There's enough to charge her now. She's protesting, of course. Says she found the ribbon in the grass at the fete and thought it too pretty to waste. Still, the evidence lines up neatly." "Yes," Miss Marple said, setting down the teapot. "Almost too neatly, like a table laid for tea. Everything in its place, but somehow the air feels wrong, as if one guest isn't meant to come." He frowned. "You mean you still think there's more to it?" "Oh, only that Mrs. Price Ridley is a great many things, Inspector. Vain, unkind, self-righteous, but clever. No, not clever enough to plan a double murder so tidy it deceived even you." Slack stiffened. "Now see here." "Forgive me," she said sweetly, "but you must admit she's a woman of habits, not of subtlety. Poison requires patience and opportunity. The second death, though, Mr. Darnley's, required strength, and Mrs. Price Ridley's arms are more suited to lifting hymnals than corpses." Slack opened his mouth, shut it again, and rubbed his chin. "Then who?" Miss Marple gave him a mild, pitying look. "That, I think, is what we shall soon find out, but you might begin by asking yourself who benefits most from both deaths. Certainly not Mrs. Price Ridley. Gossip feeds her, yes, but scandal destroys her standing. Someone else had much more to lose and to gain." That evening, as twilight spread across the village, Miss Marple went walking alone along the lane that led to the stream. The water moved quietly under the bridge, dark and slow, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and memory. She stopped where the constables had found Darnley's body and stood a long time, thinking. There, at the edge of the bank, the reeds were broken and something glimmered faintly beneath them. She stooped, lifting it carefully, a single button, dark with rust but still clinging to a fragment of thread. She recognized the pattern immediately, the buttons from Dr. Phelps' overcoat. She held it a moment, then placed it delicately in her pocket. The doctor's manner came back to her, the nervousness, The guilt not quite confessed, the insistence that he had warned Mrs. Blythe about her nerves and sleeping draughts. Too defensive, too rehearsed, and his presence at the fete, so conveniently close to the bench, so quick to declare her dead before anyone else had touched her pulse. The next morning, Miss Marple invited Dr. Phelps for tea. He came reluctantly, his face pale beneath its usual polish. "You wish to see me, Miss Marple?" "Only for a little conversation," she said kindly. "I find conversation so restorative, especially when people have carried too much silence." He gave a strained smile. "I'm afraid silence is a physician's burden. Confidentiality, you know." "Oh, yes," she said. "Though sometimes a burden shared becomes lighter." She handed him a cup of tea. "You were very fond of Mrs. Blythe, weren't you?" He looked startled. "Fond? I pitied her. She was a lonely woman." "Lonely people often invite pity, but it's not what they crave. I think she wanted someone to believe. Her, to trust her word when she said she'd been wronged, but perhaps you didn't believe her either." His eyes flickered. "You don't know what you're saying." "Oh, I think I do," said Miss Marple softly. "You knew her secret before anyone else. You'd seen the letters, hadn't you? She must have shown them to you, hoping you'd help her, and then Darnley came to collect his due, threatening to ruin you as well. It would have been easy enough to see him off. He was desperate, careless, and the stream was dark that night." Phelps rose, his breath quickening. "You've no proof?" "I have a button," Miss Marple said gently, "from your overcoat, found by the stream where he fell." He stared at her, color draining from his face. I went after him only to reason with him. He struck at me first. It was an accident." "And Mrs. Blythe?" He sank back into his chair, trembling. "She was terrified. Said she'd rather die than face another scandal. I thought I could help her. A small dose, just to calm her nerves. But she drank too quickly. By the time I reached her," his voice broke. "God help me, I never meant it." Miss Marple folded her hands. "No, I don't suppose you did. But one cannot mix compassion with cowardice and hope it stays pure. The truth always rises, like cream or guilt." When the inspector came later, Miss Marple handed him the button and a brief account of their conversation. Slack listened, stunned into uncharacteristic silence. "Well, so it was the doctor all along." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I dare say he began with good intentions. But good intentions are rather like brandy, best kept locked away. They lose their virtue when shared too freely." By evening, St. Mary Mead had settled into a curious calm. The papers called it the Primrose Cottage mystery, though those who lived there preferred quieter words. The doctor's confession was discreetly handled, and Mrs. Price Ridley, her pride bruised but her freedom intact, took to avoiding Miss Marple's gaze in church. For her part, Miss Marple went back to her garden, trimming her roses and feeding the sparrows as though nothing had changed at all. But sometimes, when the wind shifted and carried the scent of almonds from a neighbor's kitchen, she would pause and reflect, not on wickedness, which she had long accepted as part of the natural order, but on the curious ways kindness could twist itself into tragedy. And in the evenings, as she sat by her fire with her knitting, she would sometimes smile to herself, thinking how very little people understood the dangers hidden in politeness, pity, and tea. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead resumed its customary rhythm with the same quiet obstinacy it had shown after every disturbance in living memory. The cottages smoked gently once more, the church bell tolled for morning prayer, and conversation returned to its usual diet of weather, parish sales, and whose chrysanthemums had blighted early. Yet beneath the tidy surface there lingered a faint unease, as though the very hedgerows whispered about what had happened at Primrose Cottage. Miss Marple, for her part, accepted the return of peace without surprise. Villages, she often reflected, were like ponds. Toss in a stone, and for a little while the ripples spread and shimmer, but soon enough the water smoothed, concealing what had sunk to its depths. And what had sunk this time, she thought, was not merely guilt, but pity, regret, and the quiet, corrosive weight of misunderstanding. One evening, a week after Dr. Phelps's arrest, Colonel Melchett stopped by her cottage. The autumn light had faded, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet leaves. He found her by the fire, knitting as serenely as though no trace of evil had ever passed through the parish. "Hope I'm not disturbing you, Jane," he said, settling heavily into the armchair opposite. "Slack's just been by to give me his final report. Seems the case is officially closed now." Miss Marple looked up with a small, knowing smile. "How very satisfactory, Colonel, though I always think official endings are rather like tidy parlor rooms, pleasing to look at, but they never quite tell you what went on inside." Melchett chuckled. "You'd make any detective feel clumsy. You know that. Slack says if you'd been born 50 years later, they'd have had you running Scotland Yard." "Oh dear, what a dreadful notion," she said lightly. "Imagine trying to solve crime by committee. Half the pleasure would be gone." He leaned forward, clasping his hands. "Still, I can't help feeling sorry for the doctor. Foolish business. Soft-hearted men always come to grief over women. He wasn't a bad sort." "No," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "Not bad. Just weak. And weakness is so often the preface to wickedness, though the two are seldom recognized as kin. He meant to protect her, poor soul, but fear and love make an unholy partnership. Once he'd seen what he'd done, panic took the reins. I imagine the second death was almost inevitable." Melchett sighed. "The way you tell it, one could almost pity him." "One ought to," she said, her needles moving steadily. "Pity, after all, is part of understanding, but one mustn't mistake understanding for forgiveness. The harm is done just the same." There was a brief silence, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire. Outside, the wind brushed against the thatched roof, scattering a few early leaves across the garden path. "Funny thing," Melchett said at last. "Mrs. Price Ridley's taken to calling herself an instrument of Providence, since it turns out she wasn't guilty after all. Claims her interference helped bring the truth to light." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How fortunate for Providence to have so articulate an advocate." She gave a gentle laugh. "Though I dare say she'll dine on that distinction for the next 20 years. Melchett smiled, rising to go. "You're incorrigible, Jane. I'll tell Slack you've wrapped up another one for us. But for heaven's sake, try not to find any more murders this year, will you? The county can't stand the publicity." After he left, Miss Marple sat a long while by the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Her thoughts wandered, as they often did at such times, from the living to the dead. Poor Lucy Darnley, who had sought peace in a village that held too many mirrors to her past, and the doctor who had mistaken mercy for control. She thought, too, of the villagers, each with their little secrets and small cruelties, none quite seeing how close they had all come to tragedy. At length she rose, moving to the window. The moon had come out, silvering the rooftops in the narrow lane beyond her gate. Primrose Cottage stood just visible in the distance, its shutters closed, its garden wild again with untrimmed roses. The sight stirred in her a faint melancholy. Evil, she knew, was never vanquished entirely. It merely changed its shape, waiting patiently for another chance to wear a respectable face. The next day, she walked to the churchyard, carrying a small posy of late-blooming primroses she had coaxed into flower out of season. The grass was still damp from the morning dew. At the edge of the path stood a simple new headstone, the name freshly carved, Lucy Blythe, beloved of God. Someone, perhaps the vicar's wife, had chosen to omit the rest. Miss Marple laid the flowers there with gentle precision. "She was never really wicked," she said softly, as though to herself. "Just frightened, and that, I think, is the beginning of most sins." When she turned back toward the lane, she found Mrs. Bantry waiting for her, bundled in her fur stole despite the mild weather. "You sentimental creature," Mrs. Bantry said affectionately. "Still mourning her, are you?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, no, dear. Merely observing. One learns more about the living from the dead than the other way round." They walked home together, and the conversation soon turned to less solemn things. The upcoming flower show, the new baker's apprentice, and whether Mrs. Price Ridley's cat was truly deaf or simply obstinate. But when they reached Miss Marple's gate, Mrs. Bantry paused. "Jane, do you ever get tired of it, seeing how dreadful people can be?" Miss Marple's smile was kind, but there was a quiet sadness in it. "My dear Dolly, one can't be tired of the truth. It's simply life, you know, wrapped in prettier paper here in St. Mary Mead, perhaps. But the contents are much the same everywhere." Mrs. Bantry shook her head, half admiring, half exasperated. "You and your wisdom. Sometimes I think you enjoy these little horrors." "Not enjoy, exactly," Miss Marple said, "but I find them illuminating. Every tragedy shows one something new about human nature, and that, I confess, fascinates me." When she was alone again, she went into her garden and trimmed a few stray branches from the rosebush by her gate. The air smelled faintly of rain and earth, and somewhere a robin was singing, indifferent to all that had passed. She glanced toward the cottage where it had all begun, now quiet as any other house, and sighed. St. Mary Mead would remember the affair for a season, perhaps two, before filing it neatly away among its village tales. The fete that ended in whispers, the widow who wasn't, the doctor who loved too much. In time, new gossip would replace the old, and life would continue with the same serene hypocrisy it always had. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, would go on tending her roses and her tea, listening to the quiet hum of ordinary wickedness beneath the peace. For she knew, as few others did, that evil was rarely loud and never foreign. It lived here, quite at home among lace curtains and teacups, and if one listened closely enough, one could hear it breathing. The days following the conclusion of the Primrose Cottage affair were quiet, touched by that peculiar stillness that often follows a great disturbance, as though the village itself had drawn a long, steady breath, and now dared not exhale. Life resumed its habitual rhythm. The church bells rang, the shop windows gleamed with neat displays of preserves and seed packets, and Mrs. Bantry began planning the winter bazaar with undiminished enthusiasm. Yet beneath the routine hum of village life lay a faint unease, a shadow of conscience that even time would take long to smooth away. Inspector Slack had gone back to his usual duties, half grateful, half irritated that peace had returned. "Can't say I like these village murders," he'd remarked to Colonel Melchett. "Everyone looks so harmless you start feeling guilty just for suspecting them." Miss Marple, hearing of this later, had smiled and said that harmlessness was the most deceptive disguise of all, rather like lace over a cracked window pane. But there was one person whose mind had not rested easily since the case closed. Dr. Phelps' housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, who had taken to attending morning service daily, murmuring prayers for her employer's soul with such vigor that the vicar's wife feared for her knees. "She blames herself," Miss Marple had told Mrs. Bantry over tea. "It is an old instinct among women to shoulder guilt that properly belongs elsewhere." It was on a mild afternoon some weeks later, while Miss Marple was trimming her winter roses, that a letter arrived from Inspector Slack. The handwriting was uncharacteristically neat, perhaps an effort at civility. It read, "Dear Miss Marple, your deductions in the Primrose Cottage case have been fully borne out by the coroner's findings. The evidence left no doubt as to Dr. Phelps' guilt, nor of Mrs. Blythe's tragic ignorance. We are closing the file officially today. I have been ordered to convey my thanks, though you'll guess they come from me as well. The chief constable calls it an admirable piece of intuition, but I call it plain good sense. You've got a way of seeing what the rest of us overlook. I hope, for all our sakes, that your village remains quiet for a good long while. Yours sincerely, Inspector Slack. Miss Marple folded the letter and set it beside her teacup, her expression thoughtful rather than pleased. Praise, she knew, was like sugar. It dissolved quickly and left little behind. Still, it comforted her to think that the truth, once uncovered, might rest undisturbed. That evening she took a walk through the lane toward Primrose Cottage. The cottage stood empty now, its shutters closed, the garden a little overgrown but peaceful. The roses that had framed its path had faded, yet a few stubborn blooms still clung to life, pale and fragrant in the twilight. She paused by the gate, her hands resting on the worn wood. Poor woman, she murmured. All she wanted was to begin again. But one can't grow roses in soil that's been poisoned. It takes time, patience, and a great deal of light. As she turned to go, she heard the familiar shuffle of Mrs. Bantry's step behind her. "I thought I'd find you here," Mrs. Bantry said softly. "You never could resist finishing things properly." Miss Marple smiled. "It's a failing of mine. I like endings to fit their beginnings. People so seldom allow them to." Mrs. Bantry nodded. "And yet you never seem surprised by them." "My dear," said Miss Marple, "nothing in human nature is truly surprising once one accepts that goodness and wickedness live side by side in us all. Rather like old neighbors who nod civilly but borrow sugar when no one's looking." They stood together for a while, the evening deepening around them until the church bell chimed from the far end of the village. Then they turned back toward home, their footsteps soft upon the lane. Later, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and let her gaze linger on the fading fire. The embers glowed like tiny secrets, each one burning quietly until it turned to ash. She thought again of Lucy Blythe, of Dr. Phelps, of all the small choices that had led inevitably to tragedy. Not malice alone, she decided, but love misdirected, pride unbridled, and fear disguised as kindness. Those were the true culprits of most human crimes. Outside, the wind rose gently, stirring the roses in her garden. Their scent drifted through the open window, sweet, faintly sad, but unmistakably alive. Miss Marple smiled faintly, as if at some private thought. "No garden," she whispered, "is ever free of thorns, but with care it can still bloom." And so the story of the phantom at Primrose Cottage passed quietly into village memory, told and retold at tea tables until it became less a tragedy and more a caution. One of those tales that ends with a sigh, a moral, and the comforting assurance that justice in St. Mary Mead will always find its way to the surface, however deep it must rise. Miss Marple, ever watchful, resumed her knitting by the hearth, her eyes soft and clear. There would be other crimes, other puzzles of the heart to untangle. But for now, the village slept in peace, and she, with her quiet wisdom, was content to let it dream.